Great honor to introduce this panelist speaking in the Boundary Spanning Opportunities panel this morning. The three panelists presenting today are leading authorities in their field of study and will use their research and experience to offer a broad perspective on the field of socio-environmental systems under stress, in transition, and design. Our second speaker is Dr. Tim Kohler. Dr. Tim Kohler is the Regents Professor of Archaeology and Evolutionary Anthropology at the Washington State University, a research associate at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, and an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute.
Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. I am an archaeologist, and so I worried a lot before this presentation that what I might have to say would be so different. Of course, boundary spanning involves bringing different people in, that it would in fact become nonsensical. And so I was very pleased to see, in fact, that Lori touched on several of the same themes that I will want to touch on in my talk. It's a little bit odd. So I'm supposed to be talking about socio-environmental systems in transition, as you see. And it's just a little bit odd for an archaeologist to use those terms because it's hard for us to imagine a socioeconomic system that is not in transition. It seems as though there's no such thing as a socioeconomic system that's not always changing. So I do think, though, that although it's a little bit hard for me to get my head around that, that does remind us of the central importance of studying processes of change. So I'm going to do that from an archaeological perspective, but first a word from our sponsors. And you may think that that's that succinct, and of course that's true, but it's also our brains are our sponsors here. Just a couple weeks ago, there was a very interesting paper that appeared in Nature that I want to briefly spend a tiny bit of my time on, and that is to think about, in fact, what have been the selective processes that have resulted in these marvelous brains that we have. And when I say marvelous, consider a couple facts. First of all, since the time when we were Australopithecines a few million years ago, our brains have tripled in size. That's an enormous rate of evolutionary change. And secondly, if you were to arrange all the placental mammals along a regression line, a log-log regression line, and look at body size versus brain size, our brains are 6 times larger than you would expect for a placental mammal of our size. Now that's an enormous investment in energy. And in fact, we have a very peculiar growth pattern, and that is that our brains are given some priority in our growth such that, you're not going to believe this perhaps, 10-year-olds have brains as large as average adults. They may not act that way because there's a lot of other things that have to happen to that brain. But in fact, of course, a lot of the physical maturation takes place after that point, and that's not the growth strategy for most mammals, for most animals in general. So we're putting a very high priority on getting a big brain and getting it early on. Now, what could have been these selective environments that made for us to do that? These researchers in this paper identified 4 different possible pathways. I think it's actually probably potentially more. There's a me versus nature, an us versus nature, a me versus you, and an us versus them. And so they built, and I'm not going to go into details, a very clever sort of mechanistic model to determine the mixtures of these things that would have been responsible for the specific growth patterns we see for various hominids in our ancestry, including us, Homo sapiens sapiens. And they were able to figure out, using clever mathematical, mostly somewhat statistical techniques, the mixtures. And the first thing they found was that the most important pathway was this idea that we as individuals have to have been able to respond to challenges from nature. That's 60% of the action in determining our life history course, and specifically the sizes of our brains relative to our bodies. Secondly, we have another very important pathway in cooperation within our social groups. Our groups specifically versus other groups was also found to have an important effect. So 30% of the action is there. And then finally, 10% of the action is in this last bit about between individual competition. That's important, but it's interesting, notice that there's no effect whatsoever for the us versus nature, which is how we as a collaborating cooperative group manage our relationships with nature. I find this a sobering finding, since many of our current so-called wicked problems have a structure that resembles the us versus nature more than it does the other possible pathways to intelligence. Maybe part of the reason such problems seem hard is that our evolution has guided us to invest in huge and expensive brains that were mostly designed to deal with other kinds of challenges. So this research is focused on how we got to be Homo sapiens sapiens. So it's a long-term, long process argument taking place over hundreds of thousands and even millions of years. For some time now, cultural evolution has been the main game in town, featuring much faster processes. These authors did not investigate the cultural intelligence hypothesis, which would be that social learning of ecological relevant skills from knowledgeable others explains the extreme brain investment in our lineage. But we've been asked to ponder, as a part of this theme, what are the socio-environmental implications of various transitions? You can read them here. And one general response from this research is to consider that our hominid lineage has always employed cognition to respond to such challenges, and that to some degree this has always worked. We're still here with our big brains. Learning from our mistakes will often mean considering how to do things differently, and then starting to do things differently. Foresight, modeling, and analysis are examples of the sorts of cognitively difficult means we must harness in this task. Modeling and analysis also figure prominently in the 3 case studies from archaeology that I'm now going to review. 2 of the 3, the last 2 are from my own research. Let's dive right in. These all involve socio-environmental systems in transition in some way, but they all take a long view. Our first case study is based on a massive historical and archaeological data set called SESHAT, Global History Data Bank, compiled so far for 30 regions of the world, spanning the last 10,000 years. So this is jointly a product of archaeologists and historians. There's some 52 names on that PNAS paper that just came out early this year. Using 100-year time slices, they coded data on 51 variables that can be considered to fall within 9 large clusters that they call complexity clusters. So some of the variables, once again, I can't really read these things, but perhaps you can. Those are the 9 clusters there, and those are examples of the specific variables that are involved in each of those 9 clusters. Well, when you look at those time slices over in this particular article only looks at 6,000 years. That's still a pretty long time, right? They found that 77% of the total variance among these 51 variables as a whole could be explained by just one component. That's amazing that they interpret this as measuring degree of social complexity, or more precisely, as a composite measure of the various roles, institutions, and technologies that enable the coordination of ever larger numbers of people in a politically unified manner. To me, that high degree of common variance is fairly astounding. Notice that the first PC here is, the only action. All the other PCs you can see from this screen plot are unimportant. And another thing that you can draw from this, specifically in this case, from this diagram up here. The thickness of the lines connecting those components and the darkness of the lines represent the degree of commonality they have, essentially the degree to which the variables within those clusters are correlated with the variables within other clusters. And the important take-home message from this is that the single most connected of these components is polity population. That is what that means, essentially, is that polity population is forming the structures that we see in the other components of this. For example, through the commonality of a scenario in which population growth results in competition between groups, especially in the form of warfare, in which the common outcome is the survival and spread of the larger groups, which in turn provides selective advantages to the development of the other complexity characteristics included in this analysis. So this is actually kind of disturbing to many archaeologists I know who would like to believe that we have important individual agency, that what we do can make a difference, that we can change the role of history. Well, maybe. Notice that there is some variability in the pace of these changes. So what we have here in each of these diagrams is a history of the growth of the score on PC1, principal component 1, in each of a few regions here. And you notice that the speed at which these happen is in fact quite different from place to place. And there are sometimes some reversals. This is Rome here coming along, huge increase there, but you know, there is a collapse. And so these things go up and down. So they're history as opposed to just a process, if you believe in that dichotomy, and I don't quite, show that there's a lot of stuff that happens, but it's hard to escape the conclusion that the strongly shared structures of these history are therefore the results of highly constrained and channeled agency. And whenever you see a big signal like this for what I'll call structure within archaeology, actually what that does is it plays into the hands of archaeologists, because it shows that to the extent that there is a sort of structure to world prehistory, that means that we need to attend to it, because we are unlikely to be successful if we attempt to swim against those tides. Here's a little movie of the growth of these polities through time. They start off early, of course, in Mesopotamia. China comes online, Egypt comes online. This is the years through time here. I'm not going to go through this whole thing. It takes a long time, and you know your history, right? Pretty soon we're going to have some Mesoamerican societies, and eventually some in the U.S. Appearing, so forth and so on. So we're asked to ponder these same sets of questions again. And I have to say that this research and much other archaeological work suggests that these processes, or transitions if you like, are in fact not the central nexus and root source of our problems. In fact, what I would suggest is it's been our relentless and recently astounding population growth that is also the evolutionary hallmark of our success that is causing us problems. Our demographic success and ecological dominance are starting to cause problems. Of course, this is a long-term perspective. We have other problems. My second example also emphasizes differences amid commonalities and reports on a pilot study by 18 researchers, all but 2 of them archaeologists, that aims to estimate household wealth and its distribution through time in a number of societies shown on this map in Eurasia and in North America and in Mesoamerica. And what we did in this is we estimated Gini coefficients, a measure of wealth that ranges from wealth distribution that ranges from 0, where wealth is absolutely evenly distributed, to something getting up towards 1, when wealth is dominated by, excuse me, say 6 wealthy individuals throughout the world. And we looked at this for the last 10,000 years in this pilot study. You might say, justifiably perhaps, how does wealth inequality have an ecological dimension? Well, there are several senses in which it turns out to have such a dimension. One is that we have these long-standing sorts of modes of production here along the x-axis, and here's our Gini coefficients. Remember, this is more unequal up here, this is more equal down here. And hunters and gatherers tend to be very equal. Horticultural societies, which still use a lot of wild resources and are not very intensively agriculture, are somewhat more unequal, and agriculturalists are the most unequal of all. There's a number of reasons for that. One is that the societies, as we're moving from this side to this side, become more able to produce a surplus, and it is in fact that surplus which can be alienated from households by elites and used for their own purposes that makes it possible for these wealth distinctions to arise. So even a quality such as wealth distribution that we think of as fundamentally conditioned by institutions contains a socio-ecological dimension. When we looked at these through time, and I understand this is going to be hard to see, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but this is the history of Gini coefficients through time from about 10,000 years ago up until about, say, 2,000 years ago. And that's the old world in blue, and this is the new world in red. You see those are markedly different. And what we did down here to try to make better sense of that is to use this funny little fabrication we call delta years. Delta years has to do with what is computed as the difference between the calendar year date and the date at which the Neolithic locally arrived. So if I'm looking at the size distribution of households in a site in which has been agricultural for 1,000 years, it would have a delta of 1,000, someplace perhaps over in here. And so when you put them on this same comparative axis, actually the new world in red and the old world in blue look pretty similar for about 3,000 years or something like that. And then the old world begins to, which is Eurasia almost solely, begins to take off, and the new world pretty much plateaus. And why was in fact the point of the Nature article, as well as just exposing these Ginis which had never been calculated before. And it seems as though our tentative explanation is that households in Europe and Asia were able at about this point to begin to harness large animals, draft animals, especially oxen, castrated cattle, male cattle, to extensify their agriculture, bringing much larger areas into production than had ever been the case before. And that had a two-pronged result. One was to concentrate wealth in the hands of some people who were rich enough to invest in herds of oxen. And the other is it was land hungry, and so therefore it eventually resulted in the production in the old world of a phenomenon we never see in the new world, which is until the Spanish arrived, which is a landless peasant class, which of course are well known in medieval Europe, but you read, you look at the archaeological record for the New World and you don't see such a thing. So that's kind of interesting, but it's going to have some other consequences that we want to look at. And one extension of this idea that's particularly interesting is been developed by Branko Milanovic and co-authors. Branko, until fairly recently, was chief economist for the World Bank, now retired, so he's got some impressive credentials. And the point that he made was quite nice, and that is that regardless of what the Ginis actually are for a particular society, in fact there's an upper limit, which might be much lower than one, on how high they can become in a particular society. And he developed a way to compute how high the Ginis could go based on only two parameters, that is, based on the mean production in a society beyond the subsistence minimum and the proportion of the society that is elites. Just those two things, and you can compute the highest potential value for the Gini. So here, for example, we see in a society where all households make just the subsistence minimum, there can be no differentiation. Everybody is zero. That's a Gini of zero there. And so this line here goes up and gives us the highest possible Gini. And when we look at some historical societies based on this metric, here's their actual Ginis. Here's what's called the inequality possibility frontier. They shouldn't be able to go beyond that. And you'll notice that, in fact, almost all societies are quite a bit to the right of that. And another interesting quantity is that the distance vertically between any particular data point and the inequality possibility frontier is called the inequality extraction ratio. And that essentially means how much of the potential surplus the elites are skimming off. How much are they extracting from the other households? And you'll see that the societies that are quite near the inequality possibility frontier are some of these famously extractive societies like Spain in Mexico in the 18th century, and also England, Britain in India in the 18th century. There's very few places where we have the sorts of data that are necessary to be able to compute the inequality extraction ratio in places where we don't have documents. I've been able to do it for northern Pueblo societies in the US Southwest for the last 600 years. And here's the actual Ginis for these societies through time, going like that. You'll see that they're about what you'd expect for a horticultural society. They're around 0.3 in general, although a little bit lower early on. There's this funny bump here, and again, that funny bump there, and that is explained by more complex societies coming up from a little bit further south called Chacoan societies, who were building these huge structures, totally out of scale with anything else we see in the US Southwest, beginning in the 900s, and these spread up into our area. It looks to me like a conquest, and resulting in higher Ginis in by the late 1000s. That system falls apart, and then there's a revival of this complexity there. So this represents the inequality possibility frontier, and this line represents the inequality extraction ratio. So we see that, in fact, in a couple places, right there and right there, when the blue line is above the red, the inequality extraction ratio is actually above 1, which it shouldn't be able to get to, but it does, which means that these societies are, in fact, skimming a lot. They're being as extractive as they could possibly have been. Well, what are the consequences of that? We know a lot about the northern Southwest in the last 1,000 years. And this is the same Gini line here, this blue blocky stuff. In black here, what we have is the proportion of skeletal remains that bear marks of hostility, that bear marks of violence on them. And there's quite a differentiation. Down here, it's close to 0. Up here, it's close to 0.9. 90% of the individuals have marks of violence on them. That's huge. If you were to look at a medieval cemetery in Europe, unless it was a very special situation, it'd be much, much lower. So we can see that these were very violent times. Well, another thing that's important to understand here is that each of these diminutions in the Gini coefficient is correlated with a period in which there is a downturn in production. And so the question you have to ask yourself now is, was this upturn in violence the cause of that diminution of inequality, or was it simply a consequence of the diminution in production that made it so that there was starvation and raiding and so forth? Actually, I think that it's likely to be a combination of those two things. One of the questions we've been asked to ponder here is how we can sustain natural systems in transition while building social resilience. This research suggests that one social design factor affecting resilience is the degree of wealth or income inequality in a society. There are always too many confounding factors to know for sure, but it seems highly likely that more equal societies are better able to weather socio-ecological storms, perhaps because of their greater sense of unity. Well, I'm getting low on time, so I'm going to sort of skip this marvelous third study here, except I can't prevent myself from showing you this cool little movie showing you the result of having reconstructed where the dry farming niche is in the Southwest for the last 2,000 years or so, because it's constantly changing, and it's a huge problem for these folks. When it's high and dark, it's that each cell is only like 200 meters on the side, and so when it's high and dark, that cell is currently in the niche and has been in the niche for the last 3 years. Where it's low and light, the cell is not in the niche and has not been for the last 3 years. So we have this is all done from tree rings, by the way, and I won't go into the details. The dry farming niche, it's the place where, the zone within which Anasazi farmers, Puebloan farmers, could have done agriculture without adding water. And there's two limiting factors. They can be too high up and it'd be too cold, or they can be too far down and it could be too dry. And so this niche is the sweet spot in between those, and it's constantly moving around. I'm out of time. Let me point out one thing. We've been asked to consider what productive strategies are for studying socio-ecological transition. This research suggests that approaching transitions in as much continuous detail as possible will let the differences emerge from the data. We don't have to put our trust in theory. Big data should be our friend. And we can also learn some interesting things from what happened in the past, even though we should never expect the past to repeat itself. If we were to take, and now I'll really close with this one, if we were to take this sequence of the maize drought farming niche up here and join it with what's called a Palmer Drought Severity Index here, developed by some other researchers, and all these are for the US Southwest. And then if we were to join it with a model for what's going to happen with the Palmer Drought Severity Index that is developed for the next 80 years or so from global climate models, what we see is pretty shocking. This research comes from Ed Cook. This research comes from Ben Cook, his son. If we were to look at the conditions that were sufficient to cause the collapse of the Chacoan society, we see that we are practically there right now in terms of the predictions from the global climate models. If we were to look at the conditions that were responsible for causing the total depopulation of the northern Pueblo area, we would see that we're going to be there in maybe 20 years or so. So this is the way, in my view, that we have to begin to learn from the archaeological record. We can't say things like this, that we're going to abandon southwest Colorado and southeastern Utah by 2020 or something nonsensical like that. All we can say, what we can legitimately say, is we are probably going to be facing very soon conditions in that area that were sufficient to have caused socio-political changes of this magnitude in those same areas in the past. So we keep going, we keep plugging away. Thank you very much.